if you take a muscle and don't expose it to a full range of motion for a long period of time, guess what? The body goes, all right, forget that range of motion. Let's wall that off. Let's change the structure of the hamstring based on the new information that I'm getting from that hip and the space that's available. You know, all of the tissues are going to adapt to that, you know, the body's doing whatever you're guiding it to do. So like we said before, you have this, I have a limited hamstring range of motion and flexion. Well, in the FRA, you would probably go where? You have this linear problem, so I'm going to hand it off to you. Let's say I just say, you know, I'm the coach. I go, you know what, this person has a limited hamstring range of motion. It's a problem. Obviously, you don't have enough information, but based on an FRA, what are you going to look at? How are you going to tackle this lost hamstring?
We're going to look at, I mean, this is funny because this is a conversation I have on a weekly basis. You're always going to come to me with something. My shoulder hurts, my lat is tight, this, that, my low back. But I'm not going to assess your shoulder. I'm not going to assess your low back. I'm going to bring you through a full FRA because I need to know everything about the joint that you are coming to me to see, but also the relationship of how it independently or doesn't independently work from the joints above and below it, so on and so forth. So just like you've said a million times, like I don't play the guru game. Oh, I knew it. The contralateral shoulder had limited range too, and that's why that's what the rest of the industry does, and it's nonsense. So it just turns out that if you also happen to have a limitation in the contralateral shoulder, sure, let's work on that because you shouldn't. But I'm not gonna draw that line between point A and point B. I don't think that line exists. So let's look at everything above. Let's look at everything below. Let's see what the limitations are. Let's compare them to the prerequisites of your specific sport or the task demands that you're going to be going through over the next 6 to 9 months. And do these two things line up? Do you have the hip that could do this? So in your example of like the hamstring being tight, I understand what a hamstring is. I've been studying the human body for 23 plus years. Like I get it. I know it. I see it. I can touch it. But it's a representation of the relationship of tension and how force is transmitted from the joint above it and to the joint below it. So if there's something fundamentally going wrong with the hip or fundamentally going wrong with the knee, we can start to look a little bit deeper. And in our system, your system, we always have these rules in place where we always, for every joint in the body outside of the spine, we want to look at rotational qualities before linear qualities. And the hamstring being limited, we would define as a linear quality. So I want to kind of take a telescope lens in or a microscope lens in to look deeper and look at, well, how is the fundamental joint motion of the hip? Does it actually rotate? Do those bones move relative to each other? And if not, I understand you're coming to me for a hamstring thing, but your hamstring attaches to the hip. Your hip doesn't move like a hip. So 99 out of 100 times, I can never be confident 100, but 99 out of 100 times, this is why we have such success with this system. It's why athletes continue to work with us year after year, is I'm going to work on the hip. I'm going to forget that you ever said anything about your hamstring to me in the beginning, because we're eventually going to get to it. And we are going to make a hip. We're going to make that hip function like a hip should. We're going to make the knee function like a knee should. We're going to make the lumbar spine segment because it should if you want a healthy lumbar spine. After that, and that might take weeks, that might take months, depending on the starting condition, then we could bleed into everything else. The world opens up to us from a tissue-specific perspective. Everything on the human body is trainable. We can continue to adapt it in any way we want. We can get stronger, we can get faster, we can lay down more connective tissue. All these qualities, we know how to do it now. But we have to start, there has to be some kind of system in place as to how we make our decisions. And for us, it's working with rotational stuff before linear stuff for the joints of the body that are not called spine. And that is,
again, I don't want to lose anybody here. So rotational, linear. A lot of people also hear this and they go, oh my God, these guys are just adding complexity where no complexity is needed. Well, to answer that, no, complexity is needed because that's why we tend to get the most difficult cases sent to us that have been gone everywhere and things helped. So the specifics are important. But from a generic standpoint, I mean, people listening, if you think about it, the space that your joint represents a space, which is, as we describe, an opportunity to move. The more space you have in a joint, the more degrees of freedom that joint can express. So if you have a joint and the space of that joint is somehow smaller or less accessible, whenever you move that joint, the first bit of information that's going to be sent back to the nervous system about how that movement's going, the feedback it's going to come from the tissues surrounding that space, because when you move your shoulder, when you move your lumbar spine, the afferent receptors, the mechanoreceptors of your multifidus or of your deep capsule of your facet joint are going to be activated prior to the multifidus, and the multifidus will be activated prior to the next tissue superficial, and so on and so on. So if that deep tissue isn't functional, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. If you have a reduced amount of space that doesn't allow you to move where you need to or want to move, then you just can't move there. So often we say you can't move where you can't move, which also means you can't train where you can't move. So when you're taking an athlete and you're saying, this person has limited hip flexion, if they don't have the prerequisite capsular space to allow the bones to move relative to each other, to allow that movement to occur, that's a problem. I mean, that's a problem. Now, in the standard idea of mobility, you go, well, stretch the hamstring. Well, you can stretch the hamstring, right? And you do it for long enough. I mean, you're going to get somewhere over a very long period of time, but until you change that hip's quality, the information that hip is sending to the brain, that hamstring will always be responding to the information that's being sent. So even if you get that hamstring to quote unquote lengthen, which it doesn't, eventually, because the same signal's coming from that hip, it's going to shorten again. That's why you have people, this was tight. I went to a therapist. They rubbed it. It felt better temporarily. Oh no, guess what? This has become tight again. It's because there are qualities to the body. There are trainable qualities that don't automatically get trained just because you're exercising. You know what I mean?
Right.
Of course, you know what I mean, but I'm giving this to the audience. It's another good example that I always use is, you have back pain, you have chronic back pain. We know, the literature is quite clear on this, that you're going to get atrophy in your deep tissues, in your multifidi, for example.
Yep.
We know the type of atrophy you're going to get. We know that the slow twitch muscle fibers are going to atrophy much faster than the fast twitch muscle fibers. We know how slow twitch muscle fibers respond to exercise. We know the parameters. We know how much time under tension for how long is necessary in order to specifically stimulate these slow twitch fibers. We know all of this. I don't mean everyone knows all of this.
The scientific,
we know these things. We know how to make decisions. We need more slow twitch. But what happens with a low back case is you have this injury, you have this problem, and then you have rehabilitation. And a lot of rehabilitation is focused on, getting the person to move again. Let's get them to out of pain. Then let's get them to do some, bird dogs. How many? Well, 12 by 3. Why? Because 12, I don't know, and 3, just do 12 by 3.
Kind of two numbers that I've used my whole career.
And then when that gets, a little bit easier, I guess, then do more or use a different band. So this is kind of how it's dealt with. Now, and then when you feel better, guess what you do? You go right back into the gym, and then you start deadlifting, because your back feels better. And then along the lines, it hurts again. Okay, so at what point during that process did you go, oh no, your multifidus slow twitch fibers have atrophied? How do I increase the capacity of the slow twitch fibers in the multifidus specifically? Because when I go back to the gym and I deadlift, and you know how to deadlift, you go to the bar, you grab it, and you go, that's not slow, right? That exercise is not homogeneic in that all of the tissues involved in a deadlift are not getting the same type of stimulus during a deadlift. Right. It's not like everything gets better all at once. You have to be specific, right? And the more specific you are, the faster the results. So we go back to this hip, and I know you've spoke about this before with your athletes, and I've noticed, and everyone else that I know that runs a system notices, with that lack of hip flexion, if you just took your time, like you said, to focus on that hip, and you gave the hip more space, how? We'll talk about that in a second. Just put a pin in that. Then what ends up happening is you go back to check the linear problem of your hamstring isn't, you don't have enough range of motion, and it's already better, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes the problem is almost gone, right? Because now you have this hip that allows that range to occur. Now, of course, the problem is you haven't used that range in a long time. So now we have to kind of talk about how do you control that? And that's one of the differences between flexibility and mobility.